Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music's free, virtual, and very informal monthly series called Conversations with Our Curator. I am Melissa Ziobro, the Director of Curatorial Affairs for the Springsteen Center and a history professor here at Monmouth University, just a mile from the beach in beautiful West Long Branch, New Jersey. Tonight, we are chatting with Dr. Allison Bumsted. Dr. Bumsted received her PhD in Cultural Studies in 2022 from Liverpool Hope University in Liverpool, England, where she also taught a Beatles course. She currently teaches in Austin, Texas. But in addition to teaching, she's an active and published cultural studies and popular music scholar, really challenging the marginalization of women in popular music history. We'll have to talk more about that later if we have time, because that definitely is a thing. Allison's book, TeenSet, Teen Fan Magazines and Rock Journalism, Don't Let the Name Fool You, from 2024, is a first of its kind to consider the value of teen fan magazines, the voices of women in rock journalism, and female fandom to be published. Before we dive into chatting with Allison, just a few housekeeping details and apologies to my regulars who have to hear me say this over and over and over again each month. But we always have new people month to month, and I love that. And it is my job to spread the good news of the Springsteen Center. So, if you're not familiar with us, we are located, as I said, at Monmouth University, just a mile from the beach and up the road from famed Asbury Park. Now, our mission is twofold. This is very, very important to me. We preserve the legacy of Bruce Springsteen. Yes, we are his official repository, but we also celebrate the history of American music in all its diversity of artists and genres with our exhibits, our programming, and our publications. So, as a longtime educator, I've been teaching at Monmouth for 18 years now, and it's so important that people know our history, right? Understand who we are, how we got to be here, what we've done well in the past, what we need to do better going forward. But this is shocking. Some people think history is boring. And we have to present history in accessible and engaging ways if we're going to get people to buy in and to listen and to learn. And I really think music history is one of the best ways that we can do that. So we have a very, very exciting future ahead for the Springsteen Center because we are in the midst of building a brand new 30,000 square foot facility, which is scheduled to open on the campus of Monmouth University in late spring of 2026, just in time for America's 250th birthday. So, our new building will feature roughly 10,000 square feet of exhibits, a roughly 250 seat theater, a small gift shop, and of course, our archive for research. So, big, big things ahead for us. Even though we are not technically open in our new building, yeah, we're very busy. Lots of programming, lots of traveling exhibits. You can learn all about it on our social media and on our website, which is springsteenarchives.org. I also always have to note that you can donate on our website, springsteenarchives.org, because we are a registered 501c3. I will put our link tree in the chat in a moment for anyone who's not already connected with us across those various platforms. So that's it. I promise that wasn't too bad. I think that was 3.5 or 4 minutes, but thank you for letting me introduce us to you a bit, since we, as I said, always have some new names on the roster. Anyway, back to tonight's program. So, Conversations with Our Curator is this free virtual web series that features researchers and writers exploring new perspectives in American music history. I just really wanted us to have some programming that was free and that was accessible for everyone, regardless of if they can make it to our beautiful campus or not. So, Allison will be subjected to some initial questions from me, and then we will save time for the audience to ask questions, whether you've read the book yet or not. I do keep these to no more than 1 hour because I want to be so respectful of everyone's time, especially our authors. I recently posted the books through the end of 2025, which is slipping away quite quickly, right? But through the end of 2025, next month in November, we actually have two sessions. November 10th at 7 p.m., we have Alan Light discussing his brand new book, Don't Stop: Why We Still Love Fleetwood Mac's Rumors. Now, that book is only coming out on November 4th, so we were so lucky to add it to our calendar. And then on November 19th, we have a beloved Monmouth University professor and musician, Jay Sweet, who will be discussing his book on Ray Brown, a famed jazz bassist who worked with the likes of Dizzy Gillespie. So you get not one, but two editions of conversations with our curator in the month of November. All right. So, with all of that, finally, thank you, Allison, for waiting so patiently. I introduced you a little bit, but give us an overview of you, a brief biographical sketch of yourself.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Melissa, for the lovely introduction and everyone for being here. I'm Allison. I am a lover of history and the Beatles and popular music. And several years ago, I was accepted into the original Beatles Masters program in Liverpool right out of my undergraduate in history and political science. And I thought, I have to go. And then things were really history from there. I didn't know that I could really focus on the things I love, that I've loved since I was a kid, just being a fan, whether it's Hanson and Spice Girls or the Beatles, wherever it's at. I was a big Teen Fan Magazine reader in the 90s, and I still read them, but ones that are much older. And yeah, and I love to teach, and yeah, I'm a big ACA fan. So I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you.
Isn't it a marvel to just be doing what you love? I tell my students that all the time. Like, as my career path unfolded, I was just like, I can get paid for doing this? This is amazing.
I know, it's so funny is I always tell the story. I teach for a community college that I went to myself, and it really unlocked a door because of Professor Lee Moore. He had a poster in an elevator, and it was the Jim Morrison Young Lion pose, and it just said, rock and roll literature. And I thought, that's a I can do that. I don't have to only learn about the typical history. I can do what I want and talk about all the rock stars I love, and yeah, so that really showed me I could do what I wanted, and again, history from there.
Amazing. So, give us the elevator pitch of your book because, as we discussed earlier, each month some folks in the audience have read the book, but some are here to learn about whether or not they're running out to get it as soon as the Zoom concludes. So, give us your pitch of the book.
Well, I'll just say that the book is about, well, essentially, the main idea is that it questions who gets to say what is important and isn't important in music history. And I focus on female writers of teen fan magazines, and female fans, and share their story, specifically of TeenSet, as you can see a couple of TeenSets behind me here, of a magazine that had a really different opportunity. The editor, Judith Sims herself, had a very different opportunity than some other editors. But these magazines were there first, and they were writing about music when jazz magazines like Downbeat had no interest in rock and roll, and they were really encouraging community among fans, which we know is so very important to this day. And Taylor Swift's a great example of that with Swifties and whatnot, everyone devouring everything she creates. Whereas at the time, these magazines were the only place you could read about music unless it was in the general press before Rolling Stone, right? And about certain musicians when Rolling Stone wouldn't cover them. So it's really in the spirit of celebrating women, their roles, and establishing their rightful place in history that's been marginalized throughout time for a very dominating story of Rolling Stone magazine.
Why do you think women's voices have been so marginalized in music journalism?
Well, in general, women's voices weren't really the norm in journalism beyond music journalism. So I know we know the story of Newsweek and that great story like Good Girls Revolt, where women were a lot of the researchers, but they weren't their names weren't the ones for on the reports often. Not that they weren't reporting at all, because we do know that they were, but they just weren't as they weren't seen as the voice, especially in rock and roll, because it was seen as such a male thing when it really wasn't, and we can see that in watching just clips that when the Beatles arrived to America or the Stones, and just seeing the amount of women that were there to support them and buy their records and listen to their music.
Talk to us a bit about where the inspiration for this book specifically comes from. I mean, you did talk about being a big teen music magazine fan yourself, right? But it's a big commitment to decide what your, because this is your first book, right? You've done other writing, but I think this is your first book. So it's a huge commitment to decide what it's going to be about. Why this specifically?
You know, it's one of those topics that you don't realize that you are part of the problem too until you realize. Um, so for when I did the MA, I had a topic on, I was really interested in rock criticism. I loved Almost Famous. I loved the way Lester Bangs was portrayed. I loved the idea of writing about music, although at the time I wasn't the best writer. I just loved it. I didn't, at first I thought I liked like the Penny Lane character and the groupie characters. And I don't think there's anything wrong with those characters. But then I realized, you know what? No, I really am into the style. So I decided to write a piece on Paul McCartney and Wings and rock criticism. And I was inspired by that when I think around 2013 when Rock Show was re-released and I was watching at the Odeon in Liverpool, and I just thought, I don't feel like everyone loved Wings. Why is everyone loving them now? In not everyone, but the writers, right? The critics, because of what I had read, it was just so negative. And so I focused on that, and that piece is out there and published in a chat as a chapter in a book. But I decided that I wanted to continue it with my PhD for all four Beatles. I wanted to see how the press considered the Beatles, and I was just so deep into the press that um, even into the PhD, I was already, I was still in this topic, and I came across a master's thesis from 1974 from a future Rolling Stone editor, Chet Flippo, and in it he talks about TeenSet, and I just stopped and I was like, how come I don't know TeenSet? Well, why don't I know the name Judy Sims? And then I bought some, and it just shattered glass for me, as we'd say, is that it just completely changed the way I was thinking about teen magazines, and I reevaluated how much I loved them, but then also the roles of these women that just were not talked about. And that's how I got onto that topic. It just came to me, just deep in the research, just came to me. And it was a break in the pattern that I had been told, this is the history. These are the men. And I thought, wait, hold on. But what about these women? And so that's what led to it. Yeah.
Thank you. I always find it so fascinating to hear the journey that people take, or what sparks the inspiration for a certain book. Now, if folks here have never seen a copy of Teen Set, kind of walk us through what the issues look like. What were some of the standard pillars issue to issue?
Sure. So it's really unique, unlike 16 or Tiger Beat, which are great magazines themselves, especially in the 60s. The 60s is with those magazines is a very different period than say in the 70s and 80s and 90s when it's quite a bit younger. Um, but TeenSet was created by Capitol in 1964 as a promotional tool, which is really, really unique because, Capitol, it took them a long time to accept rock and roll and represent it through whether the Beach Boys or, of course, the Beatles eventually. And so they created this to get into the teen market when they realized how powerful that teen dollar was. And with it, they gathered information. They had joined the Teen Set, and they had sleeves on records, as well as the magazine where you could spend $1 and get Capitol promotional letters, which I do have most all of them now in my possession, which I'm very excited. They even gave out book covers which I have one of those as well. uh, and they gave out all this stuff to get the information. They had about 20,000 people sign up, if not more, and they would send out record or samples and letters and information on capital artists. Well, in the second edition, they still focused on capital artists, but after two of these promotional issues, which the first one in autumn of '64 is a Beach Boys one, and it's a fantastic issue, and it's done by if anyone's into Capitol Records and learning about them, it's Brown Meggs and Fred Rice, all the big executives were a huge part, and Earl Leaf, one of the photographers and writers known for the '50s and '60s writing as well. So they used it as a promotional tool, and then they decided one day to turn it into a full-fledged teen fan magazine that had nothing to not that was not specific to Capitol Records. This wasn't unusual for Capitol. Capitol had some in the '40s and '50s called Capitol News, Capitol Views, and then it became maybe Music Views. There were three different names, so it wasn't unusual, but it was unusual for them to go, we're going to send this to another publisher. They're going to control it, and we'll just wash our hands with it, and it'll still be under our name for a while until it's sold. But they really had nothing to do with it after that. And so when a publisher by the name of Lou Kimsey, who was known for drag racing and hot rod magazines as well as Dig, which was one of the earliest teen fan magazines, got a hold of it, he had a secretary in his office named Judy Sims, fresh to LA, who he knew liked music and hung out on the Strip, and said, hey, do you want to edit it? So that's the origin of the magazine. And if you read through the magazine, there's always a letter to the editor. There are stories, really critical analysis throughout, and then a development. One of the coolest things, and if you have a chance to read the book, one of my favorite parts is in chapter 5, where I talk, it's only like 3 or 4 pages, but I talk about the evolution of record reviews. So you'll see like little ones like hottest hits around to actual full-blown record reviews by '68 and '69. So you can see the evolution of when a record becomes really important to review and talk about. So yeah, the magazines had letters to the editors, the letter from the editor, and then stories. A little less than, say, 16 or Tiger Beat, which might have 60 different pieces. It might have about 25, 26 in TeenSet. But we have anywhere from Donovan to Cream to the Beatles. Judy herself was on tour with the Beatles. So you have all kinds of insight from various writers, and also a London column. They're the first to do, they're one of the first to do an in London column where they actually have a reporter there that's constantly conversing with the magazine. They're the first to do in San Francisco, one of the only ones to do it, to talk about San Francisco, and they're the first to write about the Grateful Dead. So there are lots of cool things going on in the magazine.
Now, would you say if you go back and look at issues of the magazine now, do they teach us about more than the music scene in the 1960s? Are there also things we can glean about race, gender, class in America at the time?
Oh, absolutely. You can look at the covers and the artists and gain an idea of who's being covered and who's not. However, surprisingly, the teen fan magazines, specifically Datebook, I know Datebook's the one that people think is so controversial, and it was in a good way for so many reasons, but Datebook had actual pictures of stringers. So stringers would be reporters that were high school age that would, get a membership card and write about something local, or maybe they had an interview with a star. They had this card and it worked to get them in. It didn't always work, but the press pass would work to get them in. And Datebook had it, and I believe 16 did too, and some of the others, and even TeenSet adopts it eventually. But there are women, and they print their pictures, women of color that write for this, that interview James Brown and share their stories. And so it's not unheard of in the magazines. They actually grapple with it specifically. So Datebook is an excellent one, and it's a whole big conversation. Because we will see that there aren't a lot of Black artists on the cover of many of the teen magazines. Minus Teen Life has the Supremes, and TeenSet has a kind of a weird collage of Jimi Hendrix. And then there's a few others, but not many on the covers. But in the magazines, you will find articles. Ann Moses from Tiger Beat interviews James Brown, just to give another example. There are so many different artists that are included among the pages, as well as in the international pages. Teen Screen was a great one. And in the pen pals, you could write to international pen pals from all around the world, and it showed their pictures, and it was anyone and everyone. So actually, as restrictive as they were in one way, you do see a lot of not only international communication happening through pen pals, that opportunity, but you do see coverage of Black artists as well. I will say TeenSet has one of the most interesting pieces because it has the Jacoba Atlas interview with Jimi Hendrix. And this one's really important because it's one of the most cited interviews where Jimmy actually talks about the Black Panthers. This is that conversation that everyone focuses on. But they also talk about, they interview a young Black man in Detroit, and why he thinks the Black Panthers are good or not, and what does it mean to him. So there is social commentary, especially you start to see it in the late 60s in certain ones, and in the mid 60s in certain ones too. There's so many of them, but there is more coverage than I initially thought, spending more time with various ones, especially Datebook. That one is just, it's such a cool magazine as well.
So this is so fascinating. When we look at Teen Set specifically, it started in 1964 by Capitol to help promote the Beach Boys. It becomes its own entity. It starts to have more social commentary. It's including a lot of women's voices.
Oh yeah.
You think that Teen Set and other teen magazines are kind of scoffed at by the broader music industry because it's geared to teens, or because it is so run by women, or a little bit of both?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of women turned to these magazines because they had opportunities here. So it could be that, but I do feel that they weren't necessarily scoffed at in the very early to mid 60s because that's where you could read about music. It really happens when that folk rock ideology comes in the late 60s, and magazines like Tiger Beat and 16 start to go towards a younger audience. And you can see it if you look at a magazine from 65 where they have, Mick Jagger on the cover with like his hand like Al Bundy in the top of his pants. That's a great Tiger Beat cover, by the way. To 69, 70, where we're going to see very different and younger stars. So, David Cassidy coming in later, or Bobby Sherman. I just wrote something on Bobby Sherman. He's great. Bobby Sherman on the cover in the very late 60s. So you see a bit of a difference in the change in what's being talked about. So when rock was seen as teen, it was fine. Funnily enough, TeenSet actually addresses your exact question. Judy Sims addresses it not only in her letter to the editors, as well as some surveys. She talks about the word teen and how it doesn't fit the magazine anymore because, someone in their 20s doesn't want to be seen reading something that says teen, which maybe it didn't matter in the early 60s, but now it does matter because it's uncool, to see something like that, or to be seen reading something like that. So the concept of teen becomes an issue. We also see with this shift in the late 60s is the concept of the word rock and pop, because even Rolling Stone used the word pop in a normal way just to describe music. But by the late 60s, we start to see it as a very derogatory term. So these words are changing as the social connotation of them is changing. And as the magazines move into the 70s and they become very young, TeenSet goes away by 69. It doesn't live as long as I had hoped it would. And Datebook will slowly go away. And the magazines that last do go for a much younger audience, and they're seen as fake and false. Another reason they're scoffed at is because, especially in the 50s, is those Hollywood fan magazines. People want this rock and roll authenticity, these rock aesthetics that come in, like that has to be meaningful and important and established, like Crawdaddy in a basement, or it has to be a Rolling Stone. It has to be cool, it has to have these strong, it has to mean something. And this is a big conversation that I have around Paul McCartney and Wings, because it just keeps coming up. Like, what does it mean? It's just boring fluff, and it's just, what does it mean? And those Hollywood fan magazines of 30s, 40s, 50s really influenced the beginning of the teen magazines. So part of it is they're seen as mouthpieces, which they're not. They're not mouthpieces for the record companies, which Rolling Stone becomes one at one point. So interesting enough. But they're not mouthpieces, and they tell true stories. But the general Hollywood fan magazines did not, and it's very evident. There's a lot of evidence where they would make up stories and no one would bother them as long as they didn't make the star look bad. And there was also some sensationalism, like Ann Moses and I were talking. She was editor of Tiger Beat. She has a great book out called Meow if you're interested in her story. It's really cool. And she talks about, there was a story of, I believe it was David Cassidy, David Cassidy almost died, and it's just like a silly story. Or, monkeys and Sajid Khan fight, but they're not actually fighting. It's a whole nother meaning. So there is some of that, the sensationalism, but TeenSet doesn't do that. Tiger Beat does do it later. 16 does it a bit, but there's still so much good information in the magazines. But that's typically why it's dismissed. It's just people don't value voices of the youth often. They don't see them as serious or, as learned. So they're just dismissed, unfortunately. And it still happens today.
Now, when we look at TeenSet specifically, it briefly undergoes a name change before folding in 1969. Tell us a little bit about the closure and then the transition, right, of some of the key personnel to Rolling Stone, one of the quote unquote serious alternatives to TeenSet.
Yeah, so TeenSet changes its name to OM, AUM, America's Under 30s Magazine, or OM. Judy Sims is on record in an interview with Chet Filippo to say how much she hated it, but she couldn't. They couldn't think of something better because there was a magazine, Cheetah, that was really good, like a pop culture magazine. They were trying to not just be seen as a teen magazine, not just be seen as a music magazine, but be what didn't exist anymore, what wasn't making it either, which was that pop culture magazine. And so they had three really brilliant issues, three very good issues. And throughout TeenSets, I want to point out, because I haven't said this yet, but one of the most important photographers who took some of the photos behind me was Jim Marshall, which everyone knows Jim Marshall's rock and roll photography, which he was at Monterey Pop for Judy Sims on her dime, right? For the magazine. But he transitions to OM with them as their in-house photographer. There's writers, Tom Nolan's writing for them, John Mendelsohn writes for them, and this is for TeenSet as well. Peter Johnston writes for them. Ben Fontoras writes for them. Ben knew Judy very well because Judy will then go on to be a publicist for Warner Brothers and then an editor or a bureau chief for Rolling Stone. So she's already been moonlighting for Disc and Music Echo, or just known as Disc, in the UK. So she's well known across the board. But then she just goes on to Rolling Stone and writes, for Rolling Stone for a while as well. So a lot of those big Rolling Stone names were there. Jerry Hopkins, I don't think I said his name. Those are the Groupies and Other Girls book authors as well. So yeah, they go to Rolling Stone. So they invite her. She's one of the first. I know they say Robin Green's to have the first masked head. Ben Fontoras wasn't 100% sure about that because he's like Judy was shortly after, if not right at the same time.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit here. You mentioned that you were an avid reader of teen music magazines growing up. Which were some of your favorite as we come into the more, few decades, I assume, after
Yeah.
TeenSet?
Well, so I was born in the late 80s. So I was reading them in the 90s. And I know that I'm a millennial. So mine are going to be a little different. They're not as, they're not revolutionary. They're not talking about the Vietnam War. They don't have all of that. But, I got to read a lot about the bands I liked or the stars I liked, because a lot of these teen magazines would go on to cover, even TeenSet covered David McCallum in the 60s because he was so popular. But in the 90s, I read about Hanson and the Spice Girls and Jonathan Taylor Thomas. And if you're like, who's JTT? Remember Home Improvement? He was the middle son, Randy. He was Simba's voice, and he and Leonardo DiCaprio were all over my wall, along with all the Hanson posters and the girl power. And actually, I know a lot of people think, oh gosh, Hanson and Spice Girls. First off, Hanson played their own and wrote their own. And Spice Girls, they are still extremely popular in the UK. Once I feel like once you're famous in the UK, you're always famous there. But they meant a lot to a lot of young women. I was 10 and I just thought girl power, and that was really one of the first things that, besides some Disney movies, that really uh, made that idea possible for me. So yeah, I still have a favorite Spice Girl. I'm not embarrassed by that at all. I love rock
Um,
and roll, but I loved those magazines, and I loved taking them to school and talking about them. Sharing that information.
well, you have to tell us your favorite Spice Girl now because you just said that.
Well, I heard Emma Stone and Taylor Swift say it was Baby Spice, which is the blonde, but I wasn't allowed to have the tiny skirts and the big platforms, and I thought I want to look like Posh Spice. I was
Okay,
not.
okay.
I had no wealth. I just thought I want to be like that. So it was Posh.
So this conversation that we've had thus far brings me to kind of a pet peeve of mine here in the music/music history space. And it is this idea of like what's cool or what's acceptable. And I was just on a podcast myself and it came up and I said, listen, the world is a dumpster fire. If there's a certain music that makes me happy, I don't want to apologize for liking it. Right. So,
Yeah.
why do you think there is this degree of snobbery in this space when really music should be something that we just embrace and
I found with Downbeat, if anyone has spent some time in the Downbeat archives, in the 1950s, you start to see some real, especially like Nat Hintoff and Ralph J. Gleason, Leonard Feather, Leroy Jones, all those guys, and some of them did like rock, but there was just this attitude. And when they wrote, there was a hierarchy within music and popular music, which popular is all mass produced, so I don't know why anyone thinks they can be better than anyone else. But it transfers over to Rolling Stone. That attitude that I call it an Altamont style rhetoric in one of my papers, because it happens around 69, 70. We start to see that in the writing. And I think that was so impactful to how people viewed stuff. I still see stuff. My friend who wrote A Women's History of the Beatles posted something someone wrote the other day, posted online about how a girl screaming at the Beatles, I bet you're embarrassed now. And I thought, why? I would be proud of that photo, 50 years later, be like, yeah, that was me. Right. And there also is a belittling of, especially of pop. It's just pop music. It goes all the way back to that, those aesthetics. We think we know what's best often as music fans. I often don't tell people I know anything about the Beatles, because when I do, there are either trivia questions, which is
Mm.
funny because they dismiss the teen magazines where a lot of that information came from. Um, or it's like, oh, that's cute. Let me tell you what I know. And I can't. Someone was like, oh, do you know she know? I'm like, don't tell the Beatles, please don't. So, because there is that. And I think there's ownership as well. People love to own things. And so if it's something that threatens their love and what they find, I think that's just natural human nature. But I do think it goes back to that way we started critiquing music as good or bad, rather than, hey, this is really interesting because me Bobby Sherman's a bad singer. You can't tell me that. You can say that maybe he didn't sing all of his own music, um, and then that becomes seen as less important, less authentic, and it goes back to authenticity, big time. Which, if anyone's interested, I'm happy to send you guys the McCartney article where I talk a lot about that, because it just goes so well with the teen stuff. We still dismiss it because we think, oh, picture mags, nah. That's what someone actually told me. I thought, like, no, that's not what it is.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot of things, but I do think that had such a just a baseline, entrance into our veins and the way we talk about music.
Yeah, I think that's unfortunate. And I deeply feel your comment about hiding from the trivia questions, right? I mean, director of curatorial affairs for the Springsteen Archives. I'm constantly explaining to folks it is not my job to know as much Bruce Springsteen trivia as humanly possible, right? It's
Yeah.
far more than that. You just noted casually the Downbeat archives. Are the teen sets digitized and available in an online repository anywhere for folks?
They are for me because I did it. I have not, I am I have done rough um digitizing, and that is a
You
project
created your
I am
own. Okay.
yeah, I have been creating my own. And I'm hoping that my goal is that everything becomes digitized and accessible to everyone. And it's something that I've been thinking about who to work with, how to get it there, and where it should be in the best hands possible that would, that would love it, because I wouldn't mind working with some of them. And it would mean ruining some of the magazines. That's just how it is. These things aren't meant to last. They were meant to be read. They're seen as ephemeral because of that as well. But there are ways to get other magazines too, but there is not a giant archive, a digital archive of 16s, Tiger Beats. There are a lot of 16s because they go from 57 all the way to 2001. So there are a lot of them. Tiger Beat went on for a bit longer, started a little later. Um, so it will take time and I think the right group to do it. But it is something that I'm looking into, and I'm hoping that it can be a project that we can find funding for and make happen. So
We should talk more about that in addition to the traveling exhibit we're going to work on. But I wonder if the lack of a publicly accessible archive is another commentary on the importance or lack thereof of this material.
yes, and I talk about this in the book a little bit, that libraries in the 60s weren't necessarily subscribing to teen fan magazines because it depends on who holds the key to
Mhm.
who's ordering and what they value, right? And it's still an issue of that. Um, who values what, and who's going to have it because of that. So yes, and also a lot of people threw away the magazines when they got older because they outgrew them. I regret that decision when I made some choices to let go of some of my stuff. I have gotten some of it back, but not all of it. And now it's quite expensive, which is crazy, crazy expensive. And that's another problem, is they are so expensive now because they are rarer. The ones
Mm,
in the South, they didn't last. It's hot, or rats get to them. And maybe I seem to get more from the North, where there are basements and people could store stuff.
that's
And a
interesting.
lot of women and men held on to the magazines, or still have held on to their precious magazines. And it's actually, I don't have a site for it yet, but I'm starting a project where I'm encouraging people, if they don't want theirs and they want them to go to a nonprofit to research, to send them to me, and they will be loved and taken care of and cataloged and nicely tucked. And yeah, so that is something I'm working on as well. So, but
Well, I
yeah,
would
that is
love to
part of the
see
reason.
if we can help you spread the word on
Yeah,
that,
thank you.
get that word out there that if any of our music fans have copies in their attics or basements, we've got to get them to you. So I've
Yeah,
got a
and it's
long
not, and it's
list.
any era too, because I'm looking to write a whole history, and it's harder to actually find the more recent ones, I think, because just have become so expensive and rare.
Interesting. Well, I do have to save space for questions from the audience. This is always my problem. I want to keep going with my questions, but let me ask you one last thing. And
Sure.
it's, how do these print publications compare to the role of the internet in facilitating these conversations, these fandoms today?
The internet's vast. And I'll speak to the magazines. I actually just wrote an article, a free one, on this, so you are more than welcome to check it out. It's totally free. But one of the things that I really focus on with these magazines is they create a community. Not only through one of the ways is writing through pen pals to each other, which is really, really cool, because you'll hear stories of these women who have connected all of these years because they got a pen pal address out of a magazine, which is so cool, whether it's from Liverpool because the Beatles were hot, or London because of the Stones, or wherever. And that's something that is still being researched and gathered, but that exists, which is really excellent. Another sign of like the community that these magazines created was the letters to the editor. The editor would speak to, in some of the magazines, specifically in TeenSet, they would speak to these young women and men reading the magazine, and they would speak back because they would write in. And some of those portions of the letters were published, which is really cool to see because there'd be responses a month later to the comments. And some of them were mean, some of them were supportive, some were like, stop making fun of the Beatles. We love everybody. Why can't you just like the Raiders? Why can't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really cool to see. And the other thing is the shared experience of gathering. It's really hard in the fan world to gather around the computer and sit together. I mean, in this case, we can do it, but this is more modern. I mean, Zoom hasn't existed forever, and neither did Skype, even when the internet, began. But You could sit around with the magazine and share and talk about and read and hold court. And it just created this really cool sense of community. And it was really the only space to do that. If you wanted to read about David Cassidy in the 70s, that's where you had to go. You know what? I wanted to add, just for the people listening, you asked a very important question earlier. The teen fan magazines did notice a need to reach wider communities, and in the early 70s, they actually started two magazines, Soul Teen and Ride On, that were specifically targeted at young Black Americans. And
Hmm.
most everyone in the magazine featured were Black artists and
Hmm.
stars. So there was a catered need. And in the 90s, we have Black Beat and some other magazines too. Right On goes to the 90s. I wanted to address that because I bet some people, if they didn't know that, maybe that would be something they would be interested in too. But yeah, it
Yeah.
created the sense of community. I just don't think, fandom, we can connect through the internet all the time, but it's a really different being behind that keyboard and leaving comments than holding that magazine and having that conversation. So
Yeah.
for me, I still wish that the magazines were as prevalent. It's good for the environment, they're not, but at the same time, I wish they were.
Okay, well, let me open it to the audience. As always, audience, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Just go ahead and shout out because it's difficult for me to see everybody. Or you can type your question in the chat and I would be happy to ask it for you. And I'll throw this out there too. Tell us what your favorite teen magazine was. We would love to hear that from you as well. So let's keep an eye on the chat here and we'll see who's going to ask the first question. Okay. So I've got a question here in the chat coming to me, and it's what was the approximate cost of these magazines? Ooh, that's a good one.
It depended, like around 35 to 50 cents in the 60s. And then it would go up throughout time. I know now if you want to buy a magazine that's like focused on Taylor Swift, teen fan magazines don't really exist anymore. Not in America anyways. Maybe very young ones, and they're around, $15 now. Isn't that what Rolling Stone's going for? It's 14, $15 now. So early days, around 35 cents is what the early teen sets cost. Some of them might have been as low as 25 cents, but the nicer color editions were 50 cents with posters in it.
Wow. You just said not in America anyways. Did you have something else in mind? Are they popular somewhere else?
No, but I don't know for sure. I spent a lot of time in the UK, and because of trains, you see a lot more magazines and like your WH Smiths, and I see a lot of people reading them. Just the teens are on social media. They don't really turn to magazines anymore. So it's more like fashion magazines that still exist or really young. I don't know of teen magazines that still exist in the States. Tiger Beat's gone, 16's gone. Um, but there might be some worldwide still.
Okay, interesting. You just mentioned the posters that
Oh,
would come in the magazines. Let's talk about those a little bit. Was that a huge motivator for people to buy them in your eyes?
yeah, you want to hang it on your wall if your parents would let you. It's one of the only places you could get some of these posters too. TeenSet had really exclusive 2x3 ones. One of them is one of the Jim Marshall of Jimi Hendrix, with a coat just like this, open shirt at Monterey. They had Buffalo Springfield, all of that. And you could order from 16. 16 is actually really quite interesting. They didn't have any advertisements except their own and some fan clubs. So you could order stuff from them, and they would be really cool posters that are now very collectible. But yeah, that's where you would get a lot of the posters and pinups from.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Mhm.
Here is a question in the chat again. I often hear about the role of the teenager really emerging in tandem with rock and roll. Has that been part of your research? Do you know why they are connected?
Well, it really has to do with, the end of the war and the dollar changing and who had, money in their pocket. Let's see, is it Richard Peterson who has a great article called Why 1955? With Elvis, with the arrival of Elvis, and just the companies realized that with the change in the lifestyle, especially in America, that there was a little bit more change in the pocket, and the concept of the teenager doesn't even exist in the same way until the late 40s, right? With 17 magazine, which I don't consider a teen fan magazine, that's a teen lifestyle magazine. Um, that's when our first teen magazine, where we start to talk about things a little differently and see people not as young adults. Because you have to remember, in the early 1900s, early 20th century, kids were still, you know, labor labor issues with
Yeah.
some certain areas and stuff. So the concept of what a teenager was changing. And so by the mid 50s, teenagers had some dollars in their pockets, or cash in their pockets. And now the companies finally figure it out. I think the transistor radio was a big push in that too, because
Mhm.
there was more listening, more interest, and then they could sell, and people would get interested, buy more, buy more, buy more. Yeah, they figured out the teenagers had money. They started to have money with the change in the lifestyle after the war.
You mentioned the transistor radio. We have this traveling exhibit, Music America. I was mentioning it to Allison earlier. If you haven't heard me talk about it, Music America is our nod to America's 250th birthday. It has roughly 150 artifacts from some of the biggest artists in American music history. Ray Charles sunglasses, Madonna's Like a Virgin wedding dress, things from Kurt Cobain and Tupac and Taylor Swift. But you know what? I often see people drawn to the transistor radio. It's people of a certain age who remember the transistor radio giving them their identity because they could break away from their parents' music and have their own. So I just had to shout out that piece of technology, which was so important to this scene that we're looking at.
Yeah, people could listen to music a lot easier.
Yeah. I got to shout out my mom is wonderful and always joins us. And she is just sharing that she had the poster of David Cassidy and Bobby Sherman on her wall. So
I just I just wrote a piece on Bobby for an obituary for the Journal of Rock Music Studies, and it was really fun to explore him and his fans. He's lovely.
Dean Dave has raised his hand. Dean Dave, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Melissa. Allison, great interview. Thank you for joining us. I've been talking with my students lately about kind of the different way that teen girls and teen boys consumed popular music throughout much of the 20th century, and we've looked at a variety of the so-called genres. I'm saying so-called because it seems like so much of it kind of blends, but and the genre seems imposed. But I don't want to digress too far on that. And one of the conclusions that we've drawn is that while the teen girls listened to music that they wanted to dance to, the teen boys, at least by the time of the advent of rock and roll, started to see music, popular music anyway, as something that they could listen to in the privacy of their rooms. And so, like I talked about, um, the difference between some of the acts in the early 1960s versus some of the more prog rock acts in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the difference in musical styles there and who that appeals to. And it seems to me that part of the importance of your work is that you're showing how ultimately it's teen boys grown up who dominate the rock criticism world, and it seems like it's to the exclusion of um, those teen girls who grew up into women. Notwithstanding the example that you're talking about of Judy Sims, but I'm wondering if you could just dwell a little bit more on kind of the different ways that the genders experience popular music and it's reflected in your work, and sometimes just the misogyny of rock criticism.
Well, that sounds like a whole nother thesis. No, I'm just kidding. um, yeah. So this is a very detailed question. I'm gonna give it a simple answer, because we know that if you're into the popular music world, into the scholarship, you might know, or criticism in the UK, you might know the name Simon Frith. And Simon Frith and Angela McRobbie wrote a very famous piece where they talk about women are active, or girls are active in rock, and boys are cock rock, and they're out in the scene. And there's some ways they got that right, and some ways they got that wrong. They talked about women with bedroom culture, and some of the part of the problem is that if young girls weren't allowed to go out to see music, or they weren't encouraged to play guitars because of these gender roles, it was limiting, right? But there is evidence in TeenSet and all these other magazines that girls were playing, right? I mean, more interest has been on the stories of like the Live Birds from Liverpool, and shout out, I see my friend from Joe McKechnie is here from Liverpool listening, so he's up late. And we see a lot more stories of these female rock stars. So I think it's a complicated thing because women were playing and writing about and talking and critically analyzing the music constantly. Not just the women who were writing for the magazine in the early 20s, which is still a young age, but a lot of the younger student or younger women as well. So I think it's a complicated thing with gender roles, but there are defined ones that I hope that this book and what you're talking about when you're exploring them challenges that, because I think the consumption of music depends on the person and then the restrictions that they have. So one of the things with TeenSet that I said was really cool is that when Judy Sims is covering the San Francisco scene, there's or bands like like the Experience and stuff, a lot of young women wouldn't have been able to go. I mean, their parents might not even have let them go see the Monkees, right? Which Hendrix opened it for, which would have been so cool to see both. Um, so I think it's a very complicated question. It's a question that's being discussed a lot in popular culture from Christine Feldman Barrett, Angela McRobbie, and others. And it's a very long question to answer. But with the magazines, I think there's a lot of evidence that they were very active beyond, dancing and whatnot. But I think it's great that you guys are exploring that. Again, it's just a really long question to answer. But that's a
Thank
great
you.
question. It's a good one to point out too. But my work does talk about that, especially in the introduction, in how women are talked about in the popular, whether they're musicians and belittled in the popular, throughout time, or whether they're fans. And the people controlling the narrative they're going to shape that view so much that we have to question what it is.
Great conversation. Thanks, Dean Dave and Allison. That's a really thoughtful answer. Some great conversations happening in the chat too. Eric is noting that it reminds him of the transition in jazz music from music to dance to music for personal expression. Wendy had stacks and stacks of Tiger Beat and 16, but unfortunately she does not have them anymore, Allison. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry for you, Wendy.
She's recalling all of the great merchandising in those magazines, which you, of course, mentioned, Allison. Jen Snyder poses a question. I recall music magazines that were slightly more mature to a 12-year-old Jennifer as compared to 16 and Tiger Beat. They offered primarily song lyrics, but also featured stories about artists. Do you have any idea how those more mature magazines might have been produced? And do you know if there were studios or businesses behind them?
So are you talking about like Hit Parader and Song Hits, those ones that had a lot of the lyrics in it and then also stories? I spend some time with them. Actually, the first first Amazon review of the book was, she didn't mention Hit Parader at all. I did. I did. You just weren't interested in the whole book. That's okay. Yeah, they a lot of those, and Melody Maker is a great example of that, and that does evolve into something very, very important too. Those lyrical pieces were important, and then they did have specific stories. From what I remember spending some time with them is that a lot of it did come, the stories did come from record companies. Not all of them, not all of them. Some of them would be reported, and so did the lyrics. But they would change because Hit Parader changes. It evolves into a whole nother magazine by the 70s, right? So those magazines, some of them started as early, I want to say Hit Parader started in the 30s. So it definitely would be less critical when it started, and just like Downbeat, and then they transition into that. But I don't consider them teen fan magazines because they don't celebrate all of the popular in the same way. But they are something that are very important. And you're right, a lot of people love them, such as yourself. And do you still have yours?
Yes, anybody who still has fan magazines, email me afterwards and I will get you connected with Allison. So, Allison, tonight's talk has been a little bit nostalgic and also very, very thought provoking. So, I can't thank you enough. For everyone in the audience, if you have not read it already, you want to go out and get TeenSet, Teen Fan Magazines, and Rock Journalism. Don't let the name fool you. Allison, I want to leave the ball. There it is in your
It's in
court.
color, y'all. It's in
It's
color.
gorgeous. It's gorgeous. I want to leave the ball in your court. Any closing remarks, or do you want to share anything about what you're working on next?
Yeah, so I had an article recently come out about Beatles and teen fan magazines, like the arrival of the Beatles and how that spurred on the teen fan magazine. It just blew up with that. And I talked to a lot of people who read them. So if you were a reader of magazines at any point in your life, of teen fan magazines specifically, I have an online Google form. I'm taking interviews as I'm slowly putting together a whole history. I am putting together a 33 and a third proposal, but that's kind of a secret, so we'll see that. But I am working on a few things. I've been asked to do a Taylor Swift one, considering the popular music magazines around her and how they've changed, which is pretty exciting. And and Rolling Stones one. I just did a Rolling Stones podcast. I'm focusing on how all the magazines considered Rolling Stones. So I have a lot to talk about. I feel like it's never ending because after the Stones, I'm going to go to Dylan. So there are a lot of things to focus on, but I really want to thank you guys. I know there's so many different strands, and I know the book is not an overnight read. I always like to warn people of that because it does take some time, especially the opening, to get through. But once you're in, it's exciting, right? It's a really exciting tale, and you'll read about Hendrix and Joplin and all the stars, the Stones, etc. Laura Nero, all kinds of cool stars in here. Yeah, and Jim Marshall, if you're into photography too, he has a role in the book too. But I really want to thank you guys for having me. I want to thank, let's see, I know some people here. Rob, I believe, is in Germany. Thank you for tuning in. And I also know Nick and Diane, my dear friends from Austin. So, and thank you, Dean Dave, for the recommendation, and Melissa for having me, and everyone for listening and sharing your experiences and asking some questions. Oh, Holland, sorry, Rob. Rob's in Holland.
Oh my goodness. I'm going to have to start giving prizes for who comes the furthest.
Yeah.
We've got people from across the globe watching tonight. So thank you so much, Allison. Your work perfectly exemplifies what I was talking about at the beginning that we want to do with the Center for American Music. Make history accessible and engaging, but use it. It can be fun, but it can also teach us important stories about life in America. So
Yeah.
this was wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for coming. And again, we've got 2 sessions next month, one on Fleetwood Mac and one on Ray Brown and jazz music. So I hope to see you again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Good night.